Welcome to my American history notes, where I'm going to read some of my conclusions from studying American history and talk about that. You won't agree with all my conclusions, or maybe any of them, but you should know about the events that I discuss, and the people and the places and the concepts. So, to be conversant in American history, we hear a lot of people talking about American history today and saying just gobbledygook, but let's study it, and then you come up with your own conclusions. So I'm going to begin now. Um, there was no, we're talking about causes of the revolution, the American Revolution that freed us from Great Britain. There was no recorded American nationalism or feeling of a need to be independent of England before 1775, or so Samuel Eliot Morison claims. They never felt entitled to be free of England. Americans were not only content, but very proud to be a part of the British imperial system. But they did believe they were entitled to all of the constitutional rights that an Englishman living in England was entitled to, as was the promise I mentioned when the colonies first began. It took the colonial leaders 10 years after the notorious Stamp Act to come to the conclusion that Parliament had no rightful jurisdiction over them. No, the colonies had not gotten too big for the British to handle if they had granted all of their citizens the rights of a freeborn Englishman. This was the fatal flaw in King George III's imperial policy. We would probably never become independent if we as Americans had been fully enfranchised as Englishmen. America had a great many reasons to be grateful to Britain, not the least of which was for the protection of its armies and fleets. Religious toleration and the protection of minority groups in smaller colonies against larger colonies was another positive factor. But for King and Parliament to not only not move forward in granting full and complete English freedom to Americans, but to actually attempt to enforce draconian rules previously unheard of, was a step that eventually the Americans would find intolerable. By 1763, however, a compromise was being reached between imperial control and colonial self-government, between the principles of liberty and those of authority. King and Parliament would have undisputed control of foreign affairs, war and peace, and overseas trade. Parliament ran colonial trade, and almost every other aspect Americans had acquired home rule. No other colony of any other European power had such freedom. They expected more and more to be fully established in liberty and freedom as proper citizens, not merely subjects of England, as they grew more prosperous and populated. George III and his government were not at all happy with this state of affairs. They needed to figure out how to get the colonies to evenly contribute to the cost of their own defense. England had piled up a tremendous war debt from the 7 Years' War, our French and Indian War. It seemed reasonable that the colonies should be expected to help pay off this debt, as its results had most benefited them. The Revenue Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 were attempts to raise money by taxation on the colonies to pay part of this debt, but they were done without the colonies having a say in their writing or passing. Excuse me. The American Revolution was not fought to obtain freedom, but to preserve it. That's extremely important. This was a last resort, not a burning desire. King George III's government stupidly blundered and forced the issue, much to Great Britain's everlasting loss. And we'll stop there, and we'll continue talking about the buildup to the revolution and causes of it later. Thank you.